Gentlemen, tell me, when do you think Brabham's downfall began?
Well, I think it's at the end of 1986 when BMW wanted to leave the team, and subsequently the relationship was never the same again with Brabham.
Yeah, I think it was like 1985, that sort of era where just before PK left.
Yeah, I think 1988 when they had to sit the year out and then they came back and never recovered from that. You've been listening to DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify. No, okay. So yeah, let's look at this a bit more in detail than just that.
That was quick.
Yeah.
This is the DRS train.
Brabham, yeah, they're one of the bigger teams in Formula One. It's been a very long time since they left the sport, but this was probably one of the earliest examples of a driver founding their own team and naming it after them, because after this there were a ton of other examples like Surtees Hill, McLaren, Stewart Prost, all of Fittipaldi. Most of them were not actually that successful. Brabham, however, was. They won drivers' championships, including with their team founder. They had some very innovative cars, but it just really did not end well for them. So I think, to give a bit of context, I'm just going to give a bit of a rundown of their history up until the mid-1980s to sort of set the scene of how things went for them. So basically, it was originally founded in 1960 by Jack Brabham and a friend of his called Ron Taranuk, and the actual company was called Motor Racing Developments, and this was always the official team name in Formula One, but on the constructors list it always appeared as Brabham, so that's how everyone knew them. They were originally supplying Formula 2 cars, that kind of thing, and then they entered Formula 1 in 1962. In 66, Brabham wins their first title, and as such becomes the only Formula 1 driver to win a title in their own car. His teammate Denny Holm takes their second title the next year. In 1970, things change actually because Jack Brabham then retired from both racing and running the team, and it was sold to Bernie Ecclestone. Ron Taranuk then left 2 years later, and then in 73 they brought in Gordon Murray as technical director, who I would say, along with Adrian Newey and Colin Chapman, that's the name I'm looking for, is the sort of holy trinity of technical directors in Formula One. And so they had some small innovations. So, for example, they did the first ever carbon brake discs in 76. And then in 1978, they bring the house down with the BT46B fan car, even if only for one race. And then Nelson Piquet comes in, and then he wins 2 titles with them in 81 and 83 when they take on these BMW turbocharged engines. They also had their very innovative but somewhat illegal hydro-pneumatic suspension. But then it was after the 83 title, things just gradually nosedived over the next 8 years or so, and they never really got back to where they used to be.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary, Peter. And there are so many points that you could highlight that could, in fact, signal the downfall of Brabham, back to your initial question. But, and that's why it's a subjective question and a subjective answer to that question, because there were many catalytic moments, as you touched on. At the end of 86, for example, it was Gordon Murray who had been frustrated by, the rumors of BMW wanting to leave the team, the way the team was being run, and he left at the end of that season. And, that's another component here that, I think we need to consider, that it wasn't just financial losses. It was stemming from key personnel losses, whether it's Ecclestone, Piquet, or Gordon Murray, that saw this team effectively collapse. That's how I look at it. There are a lot of things to point to and speak about when talking about the so-called decline and terminal decline of Brabham.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There were loads of a couple of keystone figures at that team. You said PK, you said Gordon Murray, you said Ecclestone, and they all kind of left in like a 2 or 3 year span, and it just created a flurry of, I think it was 3 or 4 different team principals / owners they had in 5 years, and it just plunged them into a state of, after, well, at least like 17 years of continuity with Ecclestone running from 71 or 72 until 87. They went into just a complete spiral of utter awfulness. Like the way they ended their their tenure in Formula One was not pertinent to a team that had had the success that they had just less than a decade earlier.
Hmm. I think a good point to start at might be actually Bernie himself. Because as we mentioned, he took over, even though it was his team, Jack Brabham only ran the team for about 10 years before selling it. And then Bernie, for the vast majority of their Formula One tenure, a 17-year stretch, he was the team principal. Of course, the other thing that people know about him is he had his own aspirations, and he founded the Formula One Teams Association soon after buying out Brabham. And this, again, was one of the main reasons that we had the issues in 1978 with the fan car about him is that it wasn't illegal. He just voluntarily withdrew it because he thought, well, if we keep racing this car, all the other FOTA teams are just going to, or FOCA teams are going to complain. And I don't want to create problems with them because I need them on my side in this battle against the FIA, which I'm eventually going to try, battling all for many years afterwards. But it seems the general consensus is that as time went on, he became less and less interested in actually running the team because he was more involved in the broadcasting and commercial side of Formula One.
I mean,
So right. Go ahead, Nedzo.
I was like, you could say that there's a correlation because obviously I think the first Concord Agreement was signed in 1981, and like that was their first title. But Bernie was getting more and more power, more and more presence, and his presence, the amount of presence he had in F1, inversely correlated with Brabham's results. So the more power Bernie got in Formula One itself and FOM, the less well Brabham performed. So pretty much from 84, 85 onwards, when Bernie was really starting to assert his stranglehold, along with the likes of Max Mosley, or maybe not Max Mosley, he was more the 90s, but the more that Bernie started to assert his stranglehold on the sport, the worse Brabham performed because he was focusing less and less on his team's aspirations and more on his personal aspirations to work with Formula One.
Yeah, I think that was clear that the structure of the team and the priorities of the team started to shift after they won their first title. You could see Bernie had his own interests in becoming the big boss of Formula One effectively. And you could see BMW had their own interest in running their own team or just pulling out of F1. So there were these divergent priorities that were also competing with each other that I think slowly dragged this team into the abyss. It didn't help that they lost Nelson Piquet. It didn't help that they lost the great Gordon Murray, as we mentioned at the beginning in the intro. So it's really, it was really a confluence of these factors coming together at the right time. And it's a strange team, guys, because they had so many good people working for them at one point, and they somehow managed to just disappear in the space of 10 years because everybody and anybody who was somebody in F1 in that era passed through Brabham at some point. We can go down the list if we really want to. It's just an incredible list of personnel. And the team was just so dominant at one point, and I think there are questions about their, cheating allegations. I think Bernie being in the early days in the head of running FOCA and also being a team principal, I think that's a huge conflict of interest that shouldn't have been allowed. But, overall, I want to just say that to me, personnel are the most important thing in Formula One. And this is why I think, yes, Nelson Piquet leaving was a big deal. But I want to focus in on, when Gordon Murray left the team, concurrently when BMW said that they wanted to run their own team, to me, that was my pick for the catalytic moment, the big moment, because that was when they lost their genius. The team was never the same again. Even though BMW decided to stay for the 87 season, despite the fact that at the end of 86, there were rumors they wanted to pull out. Ecclestone was no longer really interested in running the team. Murray had left, and Patrese and De Cesaris didn't exactly do an amazing job. And because they weren't able to find an engine supplier for the next season, they had to sit that season out. And I think Ecclestone said that they were going to withdraw from Formula One early in '88. So that to me was the moment, because imagine, and I put this to both of you guys, imagine BMW had said, no, we're with you. And Gordon Murray had stayed. And then Bernie had thought, okay, well, maybe there's a little bit of money here, or they had managed to convince somebody else to come around the team of equal stature. I don't think that the team would have collapsed the way it did. I think those two key, Gordon Murray leaving and BMW losing interest, and then, of course, Bernie losing interest at the end of '86, I think that's what set the wheels in motion. But I'll stop there because, I think I've spoken my piece on that. Not sure what you guys think.
There is the good point, because you talked about BMW either wanting to leave F1 entirely or making a new team. I'm not sure if Peter has a full knowledge of this, because he did a video on SimTech and they had a guy called Nick Wirth, or whatever his name was, and didn't he run that initial, because there was big plans for, I think, BMW to enter F1 in like 1990 or 91. Was he behind that?
He was. He designed a car for them to use, which then ended up being bought and used by Andrea Moda.
Oh, okay.
So it was, yeah, they had considered it in 1990 coming back as a works team, but didn't, basically. But yeah, with Bernie, it's astonishing that for effectively 15 years he got away with being a team principal and involved in the broadcasting and upper management. It's like, imagine today if Stefano Domenicali, as head of the Formula One group or whatever, was still team principal of Ferrari. That's the kind of level we're talking about. It's like, how can there? I mean,
absurd.
That being said, there were brief moments where you could argue it benefited them, but for most of that 15-year period, they weren't obviously the best team. It's just that. But this is one of the controversies of their history, is allegations of cheating and the fact that they did seem to basically get away with cars that weren't entirely sanguine, I guess, and that.
But Peter, isn't it interesting that they managed to nail the rule changes quite well, oftentimes, and that was the accusation, that because Bernie was on FOCA, he had prior knowledge of what rules were going to be introduced, so his team had a head start on being able to design the cars effectively. No way to prove this. Bernie denies, obviously, any allegations of the sort. But yeah, there was some serious conflicts of interest that F1 did not do a good job of regulating. That's for sure. So, but nonetheless, impressive team. Anyways, they really were the first team, many people believe, by the way, that had this kind of perfectionist mindset. A lot of the BMW engineers would oftentimes complain that Gordon Murray and Bernie Ecclestone were impossible to please, and that they were the ones that really drove the team incrementally to just be the best week in and week out. We see that now in every F1 team. But Brabham were, I think, the first to bring that kind of ruthless mentality when it comes to perfecting your car and having everything up to par. So we have to credit them for that, at least. But looks like that wasn't sustainable, as BMW wanted to leave after a period of time, and Gordon Murray thought that the team just didn't have that perfectionist mindset at the end of '86, and then he left. So they weren't able to sustain it the way a Mercedes or a Red Bull or a Ferrari or McLaren even were able to.
Yeah. To be fair, on your point to the them knowing the regulations before they came into effect, the thing is, there weren't really many regulation changes in that kind of window of maybe mid-70s to early, maybe like 1983, 1984. It was mainly just developments rather than changes. It was like ground effect wasn't a regulation. It was just a development of the time. It was like there was turbos. There was the only real regulation change I particularly remember was in the middle of 76. They banned the massive airboxes that people like Ferrari and March and teams like those had, where they were having huge airboxes. Ligier with their teapot, whatever it was called, the teapot car. In terms of like, it was mostly like, for example, Gordon Murray was very on top of the ground effect regulations. That's why Lauda joined them in '78. They were very on top of the turbos. They got BMW to come in because there was only like 4 turbo engine suppliers on the grid at the start of 1982. There was Ferrari, Renault, Hart, and then BMW. They were very on top. They were very on top of things, but I don't necessarily think it was necessarily regulation changes. It was that Gordon Murray was quite wise, and he was kind of like not as good as Colin Chapman. But to say you're not as good as Colin Chapman is like saying you're not as good as Manchester City in the football. It's not exactly a bad thing to say.
Yeah, I suppose the 70s and 80s, I would say that that combination of Murray and Brabham was kind of second best to Chapman and Lotus in terms of innovation and car design and the ideas they came up with. But again, that's not exactly a bad thing. It is astonishing, actually, because back then, yeah, the technical regulations were so open. Because between 1950 and 1980, the only real regulations I can think of pertaining to was chassis, because there were a lot of things to do with engines, but actual chassis, there was the minimum weight limit brought in 61, maximum height in 69 to lower those enormous wings on struts. Maximum width in 76 of 1.5 meters, the banning of airboxes. And that was basically it until they started doing the things of getting rid of the flexible skirts and then getting rid of ground effects and stuff like that. Other than that, you could do basically anything you wanted. And so that did give them a lot of freedom. But yeah, I think for me, on any topic, it's the technical and engineering side is my kind of bread and butter. And so with that, and again, this is where, as we said, a very innovative team, and they came up with all these really interesting ideas. So under Jack Brabham's leadership, because he is one of the classic 50s drivers who started out as a mechanic and then went into amateur racing, it's very different from these days where they start in karting and do it that way. Their cars under him were actually very conservatively designed because they didn't do a monocoque chassis until 1970. And Lotus, it was 1964 they introduced the first monocoque chassis, so they were quite far behind on that. 63, so even earlier than that. And then after he left, they kind of did the thing of there was that car with that had the radiators on the front wing, which was a slightly bizarre design. But then, as I said, 1976, Gordon Murray does the first carbon brakes. And then I think the first carbon brakes with carbon calipers didn't come until about 10 years later. And then the fan car, because that had come about basically because they took on, like everyone else, they'd been using Ford Cosworth DFVs until about 76, 77, and then they took on Alfa Romeo flat 12 engines. And so Gordon Murray thought, okay, well, we can't do ground effects because the engine is too wide, but the next best thing is we can do this fan. And so that worked, and then they did do a conventional ground effect car, and it was just kind of average. And then they went back to Cosworth engines, but it was when PK came in, so that early 1980s when they had the cars. Was it the BT52 that ran through several different variations, including the hydro pneumatic suspension that they won their titles with. And then even 83, they won that they didn't know until the last minute that they were banning ground effects. They'd already designed a ground effect car for 83 and then designed that new one, which had this sort of pointed arrow shape and still won the title. But from then on, it did go downhill because they tried a bunch of things that didn't work because the BMW engines are very good, very powerful. But they had, I think it was 86, 87, they had a car that had no engine cover and they tilted the engine over at like 40 degrees or something. So it had this really, really flat profile. But they found then that the engine was overheating or there were a bunch of other problems. And yeah, that was that from 84 onwards, it was sort of trying new ideas, but this time they didn't really work.
Yeah. Going back to their first kind of major, well-known kind of breakthrough, that fan car, the story of that is just nuts. It's not just the fact, well, people seem to think that the fan car was a new design. It wasn't. It was adapted from Jim Hall and his Chaparral cars in the 1960s in Can-Am, where
2J.
He used a fan that was powered by the engine, so it wasn't relative to car speed; it was relative to engine speed. So I suppose Murray's adaptation of that was far better.
Mm.
But the fact that they qualified on full fuel tanks to not show the overall performance of the car, and they still qualified like second and third, and then they were running 1-2 with Lauda and Watson, and Watson drops out with mechanical failure, as they often did in the 70s, but Lauda wins by 30 seconds from Riccardo Patrese in second place. That kind of stuff, like, I mean, first of all, you never see it today, but like they were very wise. If you look, as I said, if you look at their next cars, they had hydro pneumatic suspension. That 83 car, it looks so strange, and yet it still won like loads of it. Like, it's always the case that if it looks fast, it goes fast, and that didn't particularly. It looked weird and it looked new and it looked strange, but it didn't look fast. Not really.
I think it looks so cool though that
Yeah.
to me when I think of the 1980s, that Brabham and BMW livery Parmalat with Gordon Murray's color scheme and design, it was so stylish. You're right, it looked different to the other cars, but I think in a good way. I mean, if I look back at the cars in the mid 80s, guys, I think the one that looks the most pleasing to the eye in the early 80s is probably the Brabham cars. Certainly in 83. That to me is just by far the best looking car on the grid. But yeah, I mean, to both of your points, I think they were so far ahead of some of the other teams when it came to these technical innovations. Even if, like Nedzo said, they weren't the first to come up with these concepts, they successfully implemented them. The team was so good at doing that, and I think in many ways, I'm going to go out there and say maybe if you were in F1 in the late 70s and the early 80s, Brabham was the best team in Formula One. Right? I mean, that's how good they were. Like they were of the stature of any top team that you can mention today. And that just tells you how good this team was. But then how quickly they collapsed as well is a bit strange. To go from being the kings of the 80s, especially the early 80s, to disappearing, that's not common. And I don't know if you guys can think of anyone who's a team that's won a world championship and then disappeared 10 years later. I don't think we've ever seen that.
I mean,
So
Lotus were winning races with Senna until like 1987, and by 1994 they were gone.
but did they win a title?
They
They
won
hadn't won titles since
78.
79.
Yeah.
78,
Fair,
even.
78.
78,
Okay.
yeah. So 16 years earlier.
Mm.
Um,
Van der Waal, but I suppose that was the 50s, and that was different times.
yeah.
Let me think.
That's good. That's a good one.
Let me think of BRM. They only won one title, and then they folded 15 years later.
Because like think about it, it wasn't just that they won the title. They won the title in '83, and then 5 years later they weren't even on the grid.
I mean,
Bizarre.
Benetton entered a new guise 7 years after the 95 title, but they didn't collapse in the same way.
Everyone was still at the team though, Peter. Like that team
Yeah.
was the same team. It was like a team Ecclestone became bought out by Renault. It was the same guys, It
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
like
There aren't really, because most other former teams are ones that weren't successful off the top of my head. Because things like Mercedes, they won titles, but they voluntarily withdrew. Alfa Romeo were the same; they voluntarily withdrew after 2 years.
You can argue ones like March and stuff like that. Like they weren't particularly. They didn't win a constructors championship from memory, but they were one of especially in the early 70s, one of the best teams on the grid. And by the early 1980s, they were nothing. Like they were pretty much, I think, selling customer chassis like they'd always done to random pay drivers.
And then they came back for like 1 year in the early 90s.
Yes.
I think the difference is here. Like Benetton is an interesting example we brought up here because Benetton lost Michael, Ross, Rory Byrne. They lost some other folks too that are lesser known. But they survived because Flavio still ran the team and still financed it. What's interesting to me is that as we're discussing this, I'm thinking about Brabham. They lost. I mean, Elio De Angelis had his accident. They lost PK previously. Gordon Murray left the team eventually. But Bernie, the key to me is actually, now that I'm thinking about this, is that Bernie lost interest. And when Bernie lost interest, it meant that not only was the team rudderless from a design point of view, nobody was running this team. And the people who were the suitors were just absolutely, one of them went to prison for stock fraud. We can get into that later. But that, to me, actually, maybe Nedzo's point is the most potent in that he thinks that when Bernie started to lose interest, because we've seen teams lose personnel and win again after a few years. Benetton, case in point. They lost the greatest of the great, and they still ended up winning a title 10 years later.
As Renault, but yes.
As Renault, but the same team, right? Like it, and Flavio was still the team principal when that happened.
Yeah.
Look at Brabham. Not the same.
You could even argue Ferrari. Ferrari go through these cycles where they are one of the better teams for 5, 6, 7 years. Then they win a title, or at least historically up until about 2007 when they had their massive drought until now. They're usually really, really good for like a few seasons, but not the best. Then they win a title or two, and then they slowly decline, and they'll have a terrible season, and then they'll rebuild, and then they'll go up and be really good, and then they'll win. It's a cycle usually for Ferrari. You could even argue that they will rebuild and they'll restructure their entire team, especially in the Enzo Ferrari years. If they had a shit year like 1973, for example, after 1973 when Jack Hicks and what was his name, Arturo Merzario didn't get a single podium. He restructured the entire team. I think he got an entirely new design team. He got Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni, and they went back to winning ways again pretty much instantly.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie Ecclestone, I mean, these days he's basically just a very small corpse, but back 50 years ago, he was definitely a visionary and very forward-thinking modern person. In the same way that I don't think Jack Brabham himself would have been, because if he continued running the team all through the 70s and the 80s, I don't think they would have been anywhere near as successful, because as I said, even by 60 standards, his cars were quite conservative in their design, just very, very refined and safe kind of builds. But it seemed like from 84 onwards, every car had a different problem that meant they couldn't really get where they were. Because the 83 car, I mean, yeah, amazing looking thing. As I said, it looks like a rocket with the tiny little side pods. The 84 car was basically the same design, but the engine was actually not brilliant in terms of reliability anymore. And then the 85 car, I think, was the tires were the main problems that they had, because they were designed. They done all their testing in Brazil, in the tropics, and then most of the races were not tropical, so they didn't really work in cold conditions. Was what it was.
So that's a really good point. Why don't we run through this timeline and just talk about this, because you bring up a good point, Peter, and Nedzo as well, because Nedzo's point is actually one that I'm leaning towards, that maybe it wasn't Gordon Murray and BMW, it was actually Bernie leaving that I think may have caused this project to unravel. So let's just go back to 83, set the stage, right? Nelson Piquet has just beaten Alain Prost in a straight head-to-head. Okay, he beat Prost. And yes, Renault were a mess operationally, but Prost made his mistakes, and Piquet was the more consistent driver. By far, Piquet's best title win, in my opinion. One of the best title wins ever, in my opinion. That's not what we're talking about today, but let's just set the stage. They won the title. 84, they came second in the constructors. Okay, they didn't win it. Prost and Lauda went at it, and we all know what happened there. But what's happening in 84, though, that's of note? This is what's happening. Bernie Ecclestone, he's focusing on FISA, right? The governing body of Formula One, and he's losing focus. He's not focusing on Brabham anymore. And a lot of people inside of Brabham were saying, hey, what's going on, Bernie? Why are you talking about the regulations of Formula One and involved in this separate body, and you're not focusing on the team? We need our captain. We need someone to lead us. So 85 happens again, as Peter mentioned. The tires weren't suiting the car, and then 86 happens. And 86 was the worst season ever for the team up to that point, unless you guys would disagree. I think it's pretty obvious. Disaster of a season. Okay. Gordon Murray was actually running the team pretty much that year, because Bernie was so disinterested in the team. He was really focusing on becoming the boss of Formula One. And the car was gorgeous, as the Brabhams were, but it was a terrible car, guys. Like, Patrese did nothing with it. De Angelis had his tragic accident and died in a test session at Paul Ricard. Derek Warwick didn't exactly light the world on fire, did he? So it was at this point, and I'm just coming to a close here, but this is when BMW said, we don't want to really be involved with this. Achtung, we are going to go start our own team. And the problem was, and this is why I think it's interesting, you could focus on BMW saying that, or you can focus on Bernie, because remember, in 87, there were restrictions on turbo engines. And it was that they had a contract with Arrows and with Brabham for 87. And they were trying to get out of that and say, we don't want to be involved with these teams anymore. We want to do our own thing. And the way I understand it, and you guys can jump in and add to this, Brabham designed their car around these upright engines from BMW, okay? BMW had an upright engine and I believe a lay-down engine. But it was Arrows who used these kind of Megatron engines that were basically BMW, and they used the upright engine. And so Brabham had to use the lay-down version, even though they had designed their car around these upright engines. And so Arrows actually beat Brabham in 87. And that was when Bernie was like totally disinterested. And that was what led to them not being able to enter, I think, the following season. I'm going to stop there. But to me, that's the key period, right? And it all started, I think now when I'm talking about it, with what Nedzo alluded to, Bernie's disinterest. That had a ripple effect on the team. There's no doubt about it. I'll stop there. I'll let you guys add to that if you want.
So, to your point on 1986 being their worst season, they finished 9th in that year's Constructors' Championship. Before that, they'd finished 8th in 1979, which was the year before PK properly came to fruition and properly came to being in Formula One. And they, at the start of the 1970s, just after Brabham left, and actually it wasn't the case, it was the case that Brabham left after 1970. Ron Toranak ran the team in 71, and then Ecclestone took over in 72. So there was a little bit of a period there. And they had Graham Hill and I can't remember and Tim Schenken driving the cars. Graham Hill post 1969 was nowhere near World Championship caliber. He'd broken his legs at Watkins Glen in 69, and he was nowhere near. He won Le Mans in 72, but endurance racing is different, and it's a lot less. I'm not sure. I think it was a lot less physical than Grand Prix at the time. And they finished 9th.
So 1969, Graham Hill was well past his peak. That's what we're saying there. Okay.
Yeah. No, yeah, in 1971 and 72, they finished 9th in the Constructors, which was equal to their 1986 standings. And they had drivers like Hill. They had a rookie Carlos Reutemann, who the only thing he did that year was get pole at Buenos Aires. But yeah, by 1986, they were pretty much they were already at the point of no revival. I think on the kind of spiral down. Like if they'd have had someone come in. Like things you say, if they'd have had someone like a Bernie come in, then they could have been saved. But who was there? Like Colin Chapman had been dead for 5 years. All of the other guys, all of the other revolutionary guys were working at teams like Ferrari or McLaren. Like Ron Dennis was never going to move over. And even if he got someone who was kind of like, I don't know, Benetton were kind of in their upstart phase. If Flavio Brito was the guy running that show towards the end of the 80s. I'm not sure if there was any other guys that could have come across from some other series. Maybe Brabham's downfall once Bernie lost his interest was going to happen anyway, because you say had 1986 and 87 gone better, Bernie would have still. At the end of the day, there's more money in Formula One as a whole than in one team. Like even with Ferrari, like Ferrari in terms of Formula One standpoint, not in terms of as an overall brand with their road cars and stuff, but as an F1 team, they don't earn as much as Formula One. Even now, that's because Formula One has a big market, but Formula One as a product is always going to be more marketable and more valuable as an asset than any team will ever be.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
So yeah, I mean, so in 1984, the year after Brabham's second title, they finished 4th in the Constructors that year. The issue was, and this is probably the first point of tension, was the BMW engines were causing all of their problems of reliability. Because Piquet, he got 9 pole positions from 16 races, but only won 2 races. So there were lots of breakdowns. And then, as I mentioned before, in 85, it was the engines were okay, but the tires were just not brilliant because they only seemed to work in hot conditions. With 86, so this, I believe it was that them and Arrows, they had the same engine. It's just that Murray came up with the brainwave of turning the engine on its side to lower the engine cover, because by this point the cars had these enormous rear wings to compensate for the lack of ground effect. And so he thought, okay, well, if we can get the engine cover out of the way, we can improve airflow to it. And so they did that, but it ended up not working because it just took away a lot of power and everything else. And then they had, relatively early on, they had De Angelis' fatal accident. And so this, I think, obviously, any team that loses a driver, it kind of damages them a lot, both in terms of morale, but also reputation as well. Because they managed to get Derek Warwick in like 2 races later as his replacement. But from that point on, it just didn't kind of work, because the 87 car was a more conventional design, but desperately unreliable, because De Cesaris got a podium in Spa. He finished 8th at the final round in Australia, but every other race he failed to finish. So he had a run of 12 consecutive retirements. And it's just like, I wouldn't even bother. I wouldn't even want to finish the season, to be honest, if the car was going to be that bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just so strange that a team with this much prolific history and incredible achievements wasn't able to find someone suitable to run it. And actually, you got to blame Bernie for that. It just seems like he was hanging on to something that he wasn't even fully committed to by that point. And you'd think if Bernie just said, "Look, okay, I'm not involved in this. I'm going to let someone else run it," and committed to finding someone, maybe they wouldn't have folded, and maybe they would have entered in '88, and maybe they would still be around. And I actually think Bernie, because he was so split between his ambitions to run F1 with FISA, FOCA, whatnot, and his own perhaps ego, perhaps other things tying him to Brabham, I think he actually dragged his team into a dead end, basically. You know, it should have been decided much earlier that if you're going to focus on the FIA, then focus on the FIA. If you're going to focus on Brabham, focus on Brabham. Because the way it was, they got neither nor, did they? I mean, it completely collapsed. Of course, the things you mentioned didn't help, Peter. Nedzo, sorry to butt in earlier. What do you have to say about it?
It's all right. Obviously, looking at their driver lineup, had Elio survived, because Elio is a driver nowadays. Obviously, the guys who were following F1 in the 80s or know about F1 in the 80s know how good of a driver Elio De Angelis was.
Mega driver.
Yeah. It's difficult to measure his exact ability because he beat Nigel Mansell when they were at Lotus, but there were rumors that Mansell was hated by Peter War. But the thing is, then when Elio got beat by Senna in '85, Peter War focused on Senna. So it's kind of we got the great of it with one side of the kind of the team politics, and then he got the bad of it with Senna. But it's definite that he was a good driver. And Riccardo Patrese, don't get me wrong, especially before he became this kind of veteran stalwart in the early '90s, he was a decent driver. Like he'd shown good promise at Brabham, got a few not Brabham, Arrows, got a few podiums there. He'd gone to Brabham, I think in '83, no '82. He started there at '82, and was just kind of consistent. That was a good lineup. That lineup could have, like, in a decent car, been not. I think Elio could have challenged for a championship had the car been up to it, but it wasn't. I think definitely if the upper personnel had have stayed there, that team could have carried on just fine. Elio being around, even with someone like Derek Warwick. Warwick was a fantastic driver on his day. Like we saw that at Brands Hatch in '82. We saw that at times at Renault. It's just that by the time that he got to those good teams like Renault, like Brabham, they were on the downfall. It was just bad timing for him. But yeah, it definitely was just the upper management. Like people like, as I said, De Angelis, Patrese, Warwick, even De Cesaris. De Cesaris on his day could be a fantastic driver. He just crashed all too often and he had cars that broke down too often. That I think him retiring from 148 of his 208 Grand Prix starts or whatever it was is quite misleading because he often drove in like Reals and Minardis and all the other awful Italian 80s teams that went around, and them having like I think it was in '86 when I can't remember which team he was driving for. He had 16 consecutive DNFs. That's not him. That was his car. But yeah, the drivers that were
He was driving a Minardi in '86.
Yeah, I remember now. They were the drivers they were recruiting weren't bad until they pulled out of '88. It's just that they just couldn't get any upper staff to recruit. You could say Bernie. The thing is, Bernie didn't really have a duty to save the team. Like if we'd have known what we know now and that Brabham would eventually go bust, I think he would have. Because I think I don't get wrong, Bernie's a very cunning character, but I think especially when he's running Formula One, having history can be very marketable. I think had he known that Brabham would if Brabham would have been like what Williams is now, a kind of team that's still there or thereabouts, but not as good as it once was, he'd have been fine with that. But the fact that Brabham, I don't think he expected Brabham to completely falter. Had he got someone who was competent to run that team, like to take over from him, rather than settling onto Swiss bankers and them Swiss bankers selling it onto some Japanese investors, it would have been a lot better. But Yeah, but they had good personnel in terms of drivers. They had good. I mean, they could have moved on from They could have moved on from BMW engines. There was loads of engine suppliers back in the day. You had, if you wanted to go something reliable or something down market, you could go for a Ford or a Judd or an Ilmor, or I mean, they had two Italian drivers. They could have gone for what Minardi had in '86, which was the Motori Moderni engine, something like that. There were plenty of options. It's not like nowadays where you go Mercedes, Red Bull power, Ferrari, or Renault power. I mean, not in 2 years' time we won't have Renault power. There's only like 3 or 4 engine suppliers. Back then, there was about 10, maybe 15 even, if you reached out to big manufacturers. They weren't doomed by their drivers. They were doomed by the fact that they didn't have anyone proper to take over from Bernie.
Absolutely, and it just shows you how important that is. And you can always look at the symptoms, right? But I think the cause is what's key here. And I think Bernie's, as you say, his lack of leadership, for lack of a better term, in that period, being distracted and the other things we mentioned, that had the ripple effect. Of course, DeAngelis dying was not helpful, but I still think Bernie and the team had a salvageable position given their history. They were world champions not too far in the distant past, and the fact that they just kept dragging things on, not really changing the way they operated, not finding quick replacements, not finding a good engine manufacturer quickly, no doubt because of Bernie being occupied with his own ambitions, as I mentioned before. That's what got them in a position where people lost interest. The people that they did do deals with were totally incompetent or fraudsters in some cases, Swiss bankers and whatnot. And it's hard to come back from that once you turn the page and your team effectively has lost all its personnel, and then the people that are running it are incompetent. You basically set yourself up to fail. And that's why I don't think it's as important to focus on what happened with the Swiss banker himself. I believe his name was Joachim Luthi, or Middlebridge, or even what happened with the rumors of Gallmer Engineering reviving the team. This had been set in motion as early as 1984, when Bernie had mentally checked out of running this team. And everything else that followed was a symptom of that. So I've actually changed my opinion from what I said at the beginning of the podcast. It wasn't 86, it was 84 already that I think that the decline had been initiated.
Ciaron
It speaks
changing
to
his
both of the
opinion.
points that you made. Yeah, it doesn't happen often.
What world are we in?
Yeah, that was.
This is
I
more of
still
a
think Kimi Räikkönen is a faster driver than Fernando Alonso, and I'm not changing that opinion. Back to Brabham. Okay.
This is more of a general point, but why has it taken more than 70 years for the world's greatest engineers to build a car that can run for 90 minutes without blowing up? Like, it was just so, because again, the 1980s was a particularly bad time for reliability because of the turbo engines. But we said about having the DeAngelis, or De Cesaris rather, had 12 consecutive retirements. Then he had a run of 16. I mean, obviously he did crash a lot, but even so, it was a given that a lot of your fate, like with Formula 2 these days, was decided by reliability and your engines and gearboxes. And I'm like, why couldn't they do this? I get that that they're pushing the cars to the limits, they're all very highly strung, but like a normal road car can run for thousands of miles without the engine exploding on you, but Formula 1 car couldn't even do that for a couple of 100 miles. Like, why did it take so long till only in the past literally 2 years where engine failures almost never happen?
Yeah.
Okay. Nedzo, go ahead. I want to add to that.
Yeah, it's because road car engines are designed to last 100,000, 200,000, 300, however many 100,000 miles you want to say. F1 engines are designed to last, or at least at one point were designed to last 160 miles, which is like 30 kilometers, which is the distance of a Grand Prix. Actually, no, I don't think it is, but like whatever amount of miles it is that converts to the kilometers of 300, that kind of stuff. And the thing is, especially back in the 80s, people realized when the Renaults came along and started getting 8 million pole positions a season, they realized just how fast those engines were. And let's say you have 6 teams running turbo engines and 6 teams running naturally aspirated engines. The 6 teams that are running naturally aspirated engines will probably will probably finish like they'll have a much higher, probably double the reliability rate. But let's say you have six turbo teams. That's 12 cars. Let's say the reliability rate from that era was even a third. That's you have four cars from turbo teams finishing races. They will all finish ahead of naturally aspirated cars because they're just faster. The naturally aspirated teams will finish 2 laps down, 3 laps down, just because they can have the best chassis in the world. But if you're losing 100, 200, 300 horsepower at some points, you're just not going to be good enough. So it was better to take the risk and have, let's say, win one race, then retire the next, then win one race, then retire the next, then win one race, retire the next, then finish 5th or 6th because you're not finishing as high as the turbo cars. Because very rarely did you have every single turbo car fall out of a race. Like there were times, like for example, Michele Alboreto won some races in a Tyrrell in 1982. He had wins at like Caesar's Palace, and he won and they were decent enough at like tracks like Detroit and Monaco because the turbos didn't have as much of an advantage. But overall, especially at the start when turbos were brand new, it's like it's a new thing. They were bad at reliability to begin with, but they were trying to make them better. It was the potential that turbos could have brought. That's why they chose them over naturally aspirated engines, and that's why they didn't really focus on the reliability, because it was all about pace and it was all about speed. It's better to win a race by 30 seconds than to tune it for reliability and you finish 4th because you tuned it for reliability.
I mean, okay, even if you just limit things to the turbo era, reliability got worse as time went on, because 1986 is actually the worst year on record for reliability in Formula One, because the finishing rate was 40% that season, whereas in 2024 it was more than 90%.
So one thing I want to point out about this, though, guys, is that back then there were less penalties for your engine blowing up, right?
Well, there basically weren't any.
Yeah.
So the point is that now there's a deterrent. So that's the first thing. The teams know they have a financial and grid penalty if they blow up their engines, if they have unreliable engines. So that the emphasis from a structural and organizational point of view has changed. There's also much less creativity now. The engines are defined, the power output is defined, the model is defined. So it's easier for teams to just understand the parameters of what they're working with. And the third thing is the cost cap. They know that they can't afford, literally, to have engines blow up constantly or having to replace their engines, because otherwise they won't have engines. They won't be able to, they literally won't be able to race. I'm not sure that's a good thing. You know, people complain about this. I liked having the uncertain. First of all, I like innovation. Teams showing up with a new turbo or an aspirated engine and letting them do what they want. And I also liked the uncertainty. Okay, driver X is 50 seconds out in the lead. It's not over till he crosses the line because his engine could blow up at any time. And I think we've lost that. That or even when Vettel was leading, I remember sometimes he'd have an alternator failure, an engine failure, or you know, when Michael Schumacher's engine blew up at Suzuka in 06, or Mika Hakkinen had a few engine failures when he was leading Spain 2001.
Spain 2001, yeah.
Spain 2001 was brutal. He was so far ahead of Michael. He was on for his 4th win in a row at Spain, and then last lap his engine blows up. We will never have races like that now because of the cost cap, because of the deterrence that the FIA sets, that they destroy your race weekend if an engine blows up in practice, and because of the fact that just the emphasis has shifted to reliability rather than power output like in the old days. And that's, to me, the reason why. It's those 3 levers, the different mentality in Formula One. And I ask you, gentlemen, is that good? Because I can't believe I'm saying this, but I miss the days when you just didn't know if a car was going to make it till the end of a Grand Prix. It made the races, even the ones that were boring for 50 laps, exciting, because on lap 51, something could happen. But that's why I think, in addition to what Nedzo said, why I think there's been such an uptick. It's only been recent, as you both said, that there's been penalties for unreliable engines, and I think that shifted the mentality in Formula One.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's good having bad reliability or less good reliability than what we have now is both bad for competition and good for competition, because let's say you have someone like let's say an extreme version of Kimi Räikkönen in 2005. You have a guy who is 50 seconds out in the lead pretty much every single race, and then he blows up in half of them. He doesn't get in the record books. He doesn't get the recognition for that. He doesn't like the percentages and stuff.
True.
He doesn't get the recognition for his his or her amazing performance. Whereas you could
Very
also
true.
argue that the excitement value, that let's say that can bring some excitement value. But then again, if you have let's say you have the top 4 or 5 drivers blow up, and nowadays you have a Nico Hulkenberg win a race, that you just have people saying he doesn't deserve it because everyone in front of him blew up, because that's how people are nowadays. So you lose some and you lose some. There's no real winning. I think that the way we have it now, obviously it's less exciting. It means we have more dual races than we used to, because in a race like in 2001, like Monaco, for example, I think that year was particularly bad. You would have had at least 2 or 3 people blow up. You had some things, and in general in 2001, you had the chance of people overtaking because the cars were just a lot smaller. But that's another point. Nowadays, it's very mundane, because you know that the only chance that someone has of blowing up is if they're driving an Alpine. Like that is the only problem. That is the only thing you have nowadays. It's just, I think that there needs to be some level of, I just think there needs to be more ambiguity in Formula 1. I do think that there's no point in having 3 practice sessions. Like this is a point I've always made. Formula 2 and Formula 3 drivers are drivers we're trying to nurture to become the next Formula 1 drivers. They have 30 minutes of practice. They get one 30-minute session, and they get one 30-minute qualifying session. Formula 1 drivers get 6 times the amount of practice every single race. I think they should have. I think it should be the same. I think it should be one 30-minute practice session for every series.
But then that's one aspect of it. But then, like you said, ambiguity. That's an interesting term here, because let's think about Brabham for a second, right? Like, even if they had the practices and all that, Brabham were the masters of ambiguity. And look at 78, right? The Lotus had their ground effect that was so good. And nowadays, everything is so restricted. If Mercedes came out or Red Bull came out with a car that was so good, there's nothing anyone can really do other than just basically change the design of their car to copy that car. What did Brabham do back then? They made a fan car, or they changed things on their car in the Swedish Grand Prix. They even had the radiators in the front wing, as Peter mentioned earlier. That's what I'm getting at. There was just creativity back then. There was the element of just total surprise that someone would show up, and no matter how much practice they got in the weekend or not, they'd show up with something that would scare the daylights out of the rest of the grid. Imagine if Williams showed up with some kind of a weird front wing that had never been seen before. They showed up with a car that had no front wing, or they showed up with a car with a nuclear engine. It's a bit extreme. And I don't want certain drivers in that car if that's the case. Okay, let's just make that clear. But I'm just saying that that's what we're missing, that Brabham epitomized. They were the team that showed up with a new concept. They bent the rules. You never could be certain about what this team was up to. And combined with the massive unreliability of that era, it made it exciting. And that's why everything's become so standardized and boring and everything, in my opinion. And to your point with the free practice sessions, that also, probably contributes as well. But it's the overall rules in the sport right now that I think are contributing to that. And you guys may think now is a natural evolution. I think we've gone too far down the standardization route. This is too regulated now. We need to open up the rules. We need to make it possible for mistakes to happen, for people to experiment. And that would actually be in the spirit of Brabham to do that as well.
It's a bit clinical nowadays.
Okay, so I get that back in the day, the teams didn't have to worry about getting penalties for going through too many engines, other than the financial penalties of it. But it seemed like there wasn't the same level of concern for the penalty of having engines that blows up costs you points, wins, and potentially championships. Like that's my point. And I'm surprised that the drivers, particularly the ones in the teams where they were finishing 1 or 2 races a year, that they were willing to put up with that. And again, this wasn't just a problem in the turbo era. It had been a bit less of a problem in the 60s and 70s. But again, it was a massive problem in the 90s, early 2000s especially. It started to wear off. I mean, you would have some engine failures, but not that many in the last decade, and now we don't have them at all. Is that why there didn't seem to be. I don't know if it was just because they deliberately avoided it because they didn't know how to run an engine that could both be powerful and reliable. That why did it take so long to kind of crack that code? And I'm not convinced it's because they deliberately thought, oh well, it's better than having to start every race at the back of the grid to just not finish half of them. Because you could argue that, well, everyone else is going to have the same reliability, so we can sort of get away with it. But it's like you can't necessarily guarantee that. And everyone knew it was an issue because we had the point system whereby they had the drop off was to take into account reliability issues, and then they eventually got rid of that. And up until the early 2000s, only the top 6 scored points because again they knew that there'd be a lot of dropouts in the race. So even if you start at the back, you could do that. Whereas these days, if we still only had points for the top 6, it would be McLaren, Red Bull, and Ferrari, Mercedes would be the only people who got any points this year, really. Which is why there are arguments they want to make it top 12. Because, for example, teams like Williams and Sauber, if you're knocked out in Q1, there is no possible way you're going to get points. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, it's like, oh well, if five cars in front of me retire, I'll move up because of that. But now you can't do that.
I've always said I think that around there's always like a percentage that you want. You don't want everyone who finishes a race to score a point because, well, there are a lot of reasons. You don't really want participation trophies in a way, and it also decreases the value of points. If the team that's finishing last in the Constructors' Championship has 20 points, it looks stupid.
Hello, IndyCar.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, IndyCar does it well because it does it in a different way. But yeah, well, I think that like back in the 60s and 70s, I mean, at their worst in terms of reliability, you still had about 7, 8, 9, 10 cars finishing a race, and there were 6 point scoring places. So it was usually around about 2/3 to 75% of the drivers who finished a race scored points. So I don't think we should have top 12 scoring points. I think we should have top 15 scoring points. Because at the end of the day, nowadays, the maximum amount of retirements you'll have in any given race is 2. Maybe like you have maybe one crash, or maybe one driver, not even spinning out, maybe one driver has some sort of engine problem or engine malfunction because they need to save that engine for the next 8,000 races. And there'll be one other guy who pulls off. That's usually the maximum you'll have. So I think we should have 50. So you'll still have drivers like your Saubers and your Williams and your Aston Martins even scoring 0 points across a race weekend. But I think a top 15 or even a top 14 point scoring was golf system would be better because that's why they changed all of it. I mean, they were quite late to the party with changing from top 6 because there were periods where much more cars than that were finishing races. But I believe that's why they did it, because reliability had improved and the smaller teams would get more points, but not too many. I think we need to adapt with the times. Now like the point system is same now as it was in 2010. The reliability rate and the amount of cars that finish races is a lot better than it was in 2010. So why haven't we improved with the times, and why haven't we changed it so there's a lot more drivers scoring points?
So yeah, 2002, that was the last season that did points to the top 6. The finishing rate that year was 57%. So meant that basically for every race, it was about 11 cars would finish. So you would get almost half of the finishers not scoring points when almost half of the grid has dropped out already. So you can see why that's a problem. Whereas 2003, they expanded it to the top 8, and it was 64% at finishing rate. So that would have been about 13 drivers finishing. So again, about 5 didn't get it. But as I said before, 2024, 89%, most reliable season on record. 2010 that you mentioned before was 75%. And that was a year with 24 cars. So that's about 18 finishes per race with points for the top 10.
Yeah.
They could, if they wanted to keep it, not make it too generous, they could, make it top 12 with the current crop of 20 cars, because you're still going to have 5 or 6 drivers per race not scoring points rather than 9 or 10.
Yeah. This is why the rules should be changed, because the way it is now, I see both your points of view, and the way it is now, I suppose, it is more fair to expand it and make it the top 15. But why on earth is Formula One the sport that's trying to help people stay in the sport and score? It's just ridiculous. This is the pinnacle. Okay, this is where you come, and you're basically rewarded based on your performance more than any other sport, or should be. I don't like how it's becoming more of a set grid, and these are the players, and we're just going to keep it consistent every year. It should be a constant state of flux. Every team should be worried massively when the season begins that it could be their last season. And the way it is now, it's just too accommodating. Like someone who finishes 15th should be ashamed of themselves. You shouldn't be like, oh, I got a point today in the press conference. You should be in your dressing room thinking about how can I do better. If it's not the driver, the engineer should be thinking, how do we make this thing faster? When you reward them with a point, it's too much for me. I mean, it's ridiculous. Like there's only 20 cars. We're saying that 15 of them score points. And I go back to the 6 points of the first 6 cars, 8 at most. Top 10 is already too many, as far as I'm concerned. And this is a sport that should drive people to be better when they don't score those points. And desperation should creep in almost. And I just feel like when you expand it, there's going to be more content. Like, well, don't crash when you're racing for 15th because you may lose that point. No, you should crash if you're racing for 15th. You go for it because you still have a ton of people to pass if you want to score that point. If you expand it to 15 cars scoring points, you're just going to see you may even see processions because drivers will be like, I'm in the points. I don't want to lose this position. I'm not going to go for the pass for 12th. It's ridiculous.
I mean, if we had a point
But hey.
system like Indy cars, you could at least argue that, well, if things happen that are out of your hands, like reliability problems, you still get something by being classified near the back or whatever, even if it's very little. Because it kind of demeans the value of points, but then you look at it and you think, okay, well, whoever's always last every race might finish the season with 100 points, but then the champion might have like 1,000. So it's still quite significant gaps or whatever. But there needs to be a balance. But yeah, I mean, I guess going back to the original point, it just seemed quite surprising that reliability for a period only got worse, because in the 1980s, every season except 1988 had a finishing rate of less than 50%, but their 88's finishing rate was 54.4%, which was done almost entirely courtesy of McLaren. They just didn't seem to have that kind of consideration. It just seems a bit tragic when you see seasons like 87 where Brabham were finishing hardly any of the races. But I guess
I also think that financial problems for teams also exacerbated these issues. I mean, in yours, you see a lot of the grid in financial distress. Minardi in 86 is a good example. They were under a lot of pressure. They had no money to do anything. That's when you also see these peaks and valleys. So it's to do with regulations for sure, but it's not consistent, as you say, Peter, because it's like it got better, then it got worse, then it got better, then it got worse. And I think the financial health of the team has probably contributed to that as well. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
you could argue that this is a point that you could also make up. Engines and brand loyalty when it came to engines didn't really exist, apart from like your McLaren Hondas and your Williams Renaults and stuff like that in that sort of era. There wasn't really much brand loyalty. Like pretty much all the teams from a midfield down would just use whichever engines they could afford. So like I was watching a video on this the other day. Tyrrell signed Yamaha just because they didn't have any money, and that even though they used 50 engines in one of the 1990s seasons across the season, that was all they could muster, and they had no choice because that was how much money they had. So definitely financial restraints could be part of that. Like when teams used an Ilmore or a Judd or a 2-year-old Ford engine, it wasn't because they wanted to; it's because they had to.
So that's where it's surprising that for 88 Brabham they couldn't find any engine at all, or at least not one that would suit their car. So they'd I mean, by the end of 86, BMW had wanted to leave Brabham. Gordon Murray did leave them. 87, they managed to, because John Baldwin became the new technical director. They managed to keep Brabham for one more year, but yeah, as Ciaron said, they were given the lie-down engines rather than the upright ones. And then it was as late as April 1988 when they finally conceded we're not competing this season because we don't have any engines to go with. And then Ecclestone sold the team. He at least made a profit because he bought the team for $125,000 from Jack Brabham, and then he sold it to Walter Brun for $5 million. So he made bank from it, but Yeah, so they
Wow.
spat. But then when coming back in '89, that was when things sort of quickly unravelled. Let's say.
Yeah, that was a mess. I mean, apart from the fact that they were on the back of the grid with a Judd V8. I mean, it wasn't actually that bad of a start if you look at it. I think in Monaco, Stefano Modena was third, Brundle sixth, and Stefano Modena and Martin Brundle is not a bad lineup. Okay, that's not exactly like a lineup that's considered to be the worst on the grid. That's a solid partnership with two very competent drivers. One of whom became one of the greatest commentators in sports history. So I mean, it's a well known lineup. But uh, again, like the leadership component matters, and '89 was going decently, and then the guy who bought the team from Bernie, Joachim Luthi, got arrested for tax fraud in the middle of '89, and then the team switched owners again within the space of a few months. And there was tons of internal dispute over ownership of this team during this period, of which Middlebridge Racing emerged as the owner after all of it. So that's just chaos. Like that is just the definition of how not to run a Formula One team. It's bad enough you missed '88. Then you get in '89, you have a Judd V8. You're an average team. You've got Brundle and Modena. It's a decent lineup. And any momentum you might have had got completely thrown out the window when your owner gets arrested for tax fraud. Good luck. That's just not how you run a Formula One team. So, I'm not sure if Nedzo, you had anything to add to that specific sequence of events there in Brabham's history.
I don't really think so. I think that, yeah, Walter Brun, obviously, he had other F1 escapades, like with Euro Brun. I mean, he'd had the Brun racing team in endurance racing for quite a while before that, and they'd had some success. I think they'd won Le Mans at some point, at least in class. I think at one point they'd won Le Mans, and they were decent. And obviously, Euro Brun came in and was awful. So I suppose maybe him taking over Brabham was just a sign of what was going to come for him. But yeah, they just had no, like, selling it to Joachim Luthi. I think he put them a couple of million in debt, and Middlebridge said they were going to recover it, and they just couldn't, or they didn't want to, or whatever reason they didn't, that the debt didn't recover. It just didn't happen, and they hired paid drivers. I mean, they had I think 1990. I can't remember the drivers they had in 1990, but I think in 1991 they had Brundle and Blundell, which was interesting. I think on the Speed channel, I think they said this for Ligier in '93 because Brundle and Blundell partnered each other at Ligier in '93, and I think the Speed channel commentators in America said that the Japanese commentators might have some fun pronouncing those two names together in a team.
So Nedzo, before you continue,
Yeah.
in 1990, it was David Brabham.
Oh,
It was
David
Jack
Brabham.
Brabham's youngest son, and Stefano Modena.
Yeah.
They had a Judd V8. They had Pirelli tires. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'd suggest I think Modena was a good driver, but he was kind of like the Stoffel Van Dorn of the late '80s, early '90s. He won F3000, was considered to be his next biggest thing. He'd made his debut at Australia or Adelaide at the time. I think he got like 5th place on his debut. Was very good on his debut, and then from there, just kind of middled. It wasn't bad necessarily, but he never reached the heights he was supposed to reach. He was supposed to be the next big Italian thing, the next De Angelis, the next Alboreto even, and he just never was. I know if they had Brundle and Blundell, I'll get there eventually. I think in 1991, 92, and then in '92 they started the season with Giovanna Amati, and I think Peter will correct me on this pronunciation. Eric van der Poel.
On the polar, yeah, roughly. Yeah, they the only real continuity they had from their past at this time was Herbie Blash, who people these days might know because he's part of the team of race directors. But he'd been the team manager, which basically is team principal of Brabham since about 1973, and then he left in '88. But then he came back in '89 as sporting director. They had him, so that there seems to be, because as well as Bernie Ecclestone, Charlie Whiting also worked for Brabham. He was PK's chief mechanic in the early '80s, and he was there. And even Ron Dennis was there for a couple of years in the early 1970s before he founded his own team and then went on to join McLaren. So they've got all these quite senior figures that have been involved with Brabham at one time or another. But yeah, by this point, it was just kind of a ragtag thing because they were going through all these leaders and buying people out, and the drivers were changing rapidly because there was a sense of coming full circle to have David drive for his father's former team, even though he had several failures to qualify, and in 1990 finished only a single race, whereas Modena didn't get any points but still finished 6 races. And yeah, it was just this thing. This was mostly what Herbie Blash was behind with getting engine deals, because and I know this because I'm researching this for an own video of mine, is that people switching engines constantly, because when the turbo ban in '89, the new regulations were okay, maximum displacement 3.5 liters, any configuration you like. So people were switching for several years between V8s, V10s, and V12s, except for Life, who did a W12, and then Coloni, who tried that Subaru Flat 12. And they were the same because they had this the Judd V8, and then they had the Yamaha engine, and then they went back to a Judd V10 for their final season. So it was just kind of chaotic, really, and kind of rudderless in those last few years.
It certainly was, and you just have to listen to the way that they ran the team. I mean, Giovanna Amati, for those that don't know, was a female racing driver. She tested for Benetton, but her results in Formula 3000 were a joke. So you may ask yourself, why on earth was she driving for Brabham? The reason is she had a rumored relationship with Flavio Briatore.
He gave her the full casting couch experience, basically.
Yes. So I mean, that's already a disgrace. Okay, that's a team that 8 years prior had just beaten Alain Prost head to head with Nelson Piquet. Now they have some pay driver, female token driver, and Eric Van de Poel in the car. Amati was replaced after 3 races by Damon Hill. Huge upgrade, okay? And at the end of the day, Damon was the only driver that even appeared on the grid at the Hungarian Grand Prix in 91, which was their last race. And the same thing that plagued them also prevented them from coming back, because they disappeared from the grid, and there was another final attempt in 93 to bring them back through a group called Gallmer Engineering. And they had looked at these Brabham designs to think about maybe coming back, but they had another financial dispute. So that sums up. That's a good case study for how not to run a Formula One team and why management is important. You can have the big names like Gordon Murray, Adrian Newey, Colin Chapman, Rory Byrne, Sergio Rinland. In fact, Sergio Rinland was involved with the team in these years.
1990, I think.
But exactly. But if you don't have that management, that senior management, guiding the team, making the right decisions, making sure the right drivers are signed, not Flavio Briatore's side girl, basically, you will not succeed. And Brabham is a classic example of that, why you need people at every level, and especially the top management, to be fully invested in this team, because this was just a collapse of epic proportions. And you rarely see such infighting and financial disputes in a team that had won the Formula One World Championship, beating Alain Prost in '83, to 8 years later being the joke of the grid in many ways, and 10 years later completely having disappeared from Formula One. Tragic. Absolutely tragic.
I mean, 92, their funny year, it was a funny year, really, because they mostly failed to qualify for a lot of races. They're technically unclassified in the Constructors' Championship because they didn't score any points, but realistically, they finished 15th out of 16 entries. The thing is, they didn't have to do pre-qualifying, whereas Venturi, Fondmetal, and Andrea Moda all did. And so they beat Andrea Moda, but Fondmetal and Venturi most of the time both made it into qualifying and then also beat them to make the top 26. So they were realistically, they were behind. They didn't have to do pre-qualifying, but they were still kind of falling behind these teams. And Venturi famously is the one that had the Klaus Volz, the wanted mobster and serial killer who owned the team and then got shot in a standoff with the police, and yeah.
Good heavens! But remind us, Peter, why did they get that privilege and Venturi didn't have that again?
I think
Why did
it's
they?
based on constructors' position from the previous season.
Yeah.
Because in 91 they did score points. They finished 10th in the constructors in 91. And so they did. There was a.
Okay.
I remember that because Andrea Moda only lasted a couple of races longer, and after Brabham pulled out, they no longer had to do pre-qualifying anymore. Was a change that happened, and I think that I don't know if they were doing it by this point, but there was a system where mid-season they would change the pre-qualifiers based on if you'd scored any points, and I think because the other teams hadn't, or Venturi had, but not Fond Metal.
So hold on. I just want to make sure I understand the view and their listeners understand. So because Brabham didn't compete in one of the seasons,
Yeah, it was because. Okay, so basically with 16 teams, there were 32 drivers attempting to qualify for each race, but they would only allow 30 to compete in qualifying. So once Brabham had pulled out, Andrea Moda was still there. There were 30 cars, so there was no longer a need to do pre-qualifying. But then it meant that the bottom 4 drivers wouldn't start the race because they could only fit 26 cars on the grid. So the pre-qualifying was when you had more than 30, basically more than 15 teams competing. I know that the year before they definitely had this system because Jordan as a new team had to do pre-qualifying, but by mid-season because they'd scored points already, they then advanced out of the pre-qualifying group, and then a couple of other teams got demoted. I don't think it changed in 92 because Fond Metal got a point, but Venturi didn't, and or Venturi got a point.
Ideally, just ideally, you don't want to be in pre-qualifying, basically. I mean,
no,
that
if you can
increases
possibly help
your
it. But the thing is, Brabham weren't in pre-qualifying, but they were still not qualifying for races. So they were finishing basically 27th and higher was where they were qualifying for most races. So that had they been in pre-qualifying, they would have probably never qualified for got out of pre-qualifying that season. Even with Damon Hill, because he doesn't exactly speak highly of that car, but the thing is, at the same time, he was already a Williams test driver. So I imagine it was a massive culture shock to go from one of the greatest cars ever built to one of the worst cars ever built.
I mean, that's a really interesting thought experiment, actually, because he really was driving one of the greatest cars ever at Williams. So, good experience for him. And Damon was, I think Damon probably got all he could out of that because at least he got a chance to drive a Formula One car, but he really got thrown into the deep end the year after. That's for sure. So,
I have his autobiography now, so I need to read that and see if he says much about Brabham in there.
This is a good point because we were talking about this. Brabham was obviously pretty much I think we can all agree pretty much, apart from maybe the Andrea Moda, even though that was actually a decent chassis, we can say that the Brabham was the worst car on the 1992 grid. Has any driver ever had a bigger step up in terms of machinery from one season to the next, in terms of going from a car that was, let's say, 15th fastest because they finished 15th in constructor standings to first fastest, like he did at Williams in 93. Has any driver ever had that big a step up in car performance?
There might be an example in the 60s or 70s. You could probably think of someone that did. I mean, Lauda going from March to Ferrari was a fairly substantial jump.
It was BRM to Ferrari.
BRM to Ferrari, even.
Russell to Mercedes.
Oh yeah, Williams to Mercedes. Yeah, I mean that Mercedes was not the best, but it was an improve. I mean that's kind of analogous to Leclerc going from Sauber to Ferrari, or even Kimi going from Sauber to McLaren.
You know what? This is interesting, Peter, because I'm actually looking at some quotes that Damon made, and I think you both touched on this because he first says that, look, I didn't. I drove for them when they were in F3000 for Middleridge in F3000, but then when I drove the Brabham for the first time in '91, after Giovanna Amati's money didn't come in, it was a completely rubbish car and at the back of the grid. But I wanted to know what it's like to be in a Grand Prix. I needed to get the experience because everybody could see the times I was doing in the active Williams, but it wasn't registering because I wasn't competing. When I drove at Monaco, I couldn't shift gears because it was so tight in the cockpit. I couldn't get the gear lever across to get all the gears So it only had 4 gears at Monaco. I went around the hairpin in about third gear. I qualified the car for the 92 British Grand Prix. So my takeaway from this car was a piece of garbage. And it took 6 attempts to get that car in 92 on the grid. So actually, I don't think there's ever been a bigger step up because that Williams that Russell drove was a lot better than the Brabham Damon Hill was in.
Mhm.
I mean, that is absurd.
I'm trying to because of course he did get that podium that isn't a podium at Spa.
Right.
I'm trying to think if there are any because I mean Keke Rosberg he went from Fittipaldi to Williams, but Fittipaldi weren't that bad.
We're like 10th fastest team in 1981, something around that.
To what was probably third fastest in 82, but just more reliable than the turbo cars.
Who was the driver that lost to Jarno Trulli in 2004 before he
Cristiano
left the team?
D'Amata.
No,
Cristiano
no,
D'Amata.
it was another. It was a Spanish driver who
from-
was Trulli's teammate. I can't remember his name now.
Was
you
it
guys
Mark
remember his
Genet?
name? Was it Mark Genet? No, I think Genet was
it
at another
Alonso?
team in 04. Was it? Oh, yeah, Fernando Alonso. Yeah, that guy. Wasn't he in a minority and then he went to test for Renault the year after? I mean, that was a pretty big jump. Not as big as this probably though.
I mean that was back marker to midfield. Like if he'd got so that's not quite the jump. Hakkinen that won't. Lotus to no, that's not big enough. Lotus to McLaren. Villeneuve went backwards, so he doesn't count. The Jordan to Benetton for Michael is not big enough.
Mansell, Lotus to Williams. Actually, that probably
Lotus
is not.
were...
No, the 80.
Lotus were good.
Yeah, Lotus were good. Hunt, no, the Hesketh was reasonably good actually.
Yes.
To McLaren. Fittipaldi started at Lotus. Scheckter, those were all good cars. The Tyrrells.
You're just going for all the champions, aren't you?
I am. I'm just going for every champion. Hawthorne.
I mean, Jones, you could argue, went from Harry Stiller's. It was a customer shop. I think they used Lola's. They went from those to
Williams.
Yeah. Oh,
So-
I think there was a team in between. It was I always get confused between him and John Watson because one of them won for Penske and the other one won for Shadow. I think it was.
Oh, with
Jones-
Shadow. His first win was with Shadow. Jones. Austria 77.
I always get because one of them won at Austria 76 and the other one at Austria 77. Watson.
Something like that. I mean, the 70s teams all just blur into one for me. I find they're all marches somehow. What are the other champions?
I mean, Jackie Stewart. I mean, they say like Owen Racing. I mean, he got a podium in the BRM Owen. So when he went from BRM to Matra, I mean, it wasn't as big a jump in my opinion. It was a big jump, but that's one some people I've heard mention. I don't think that's comparable to what
an equivalent would have been if he'd gone from a Formula 2 team, or if he'd gone from that team that made a wooden car and then gone to Matra or something. Yeah, I think this is the biggest jump. This is why Damon Hill's career is a very strange one. It's really bizarre, the trajectory, and it was also very short as well.
He wasn't particularly good.
He started at 32 years old too, though. He started so late.
I know. It's just everything is like he starts really late in a shit car whilst testing an amazing one. He then moves into the best team. He stat pads with them for 4 seasons or whatever, and then they kick him out for Frentzen, who's good but not the best. And then he goes.
I still think that 96 Frentzen was better than 96 Hill.
In the Sauber.
Frentzen was a good driver, but it's hard to say.
He was good. He was good, but not. I mean, I don't want to turn him off coming on the podcast, but he wasn't the best. He was just good. He wasn't like a future champion.
Let me say what I think on that quickly before you continue, Peter. I don't want to belabor this point. I think Frentzen, at the speed Damon had, absolutely had the speed, if not more. Frentzen was mentally fragile compared to Damon. Damon, you felt, really did not fear fighting Michael, even if he didn't do a good job all the time. Damon would go head in and say, "Look, I'm here to win this title," and you felt he was ready for it. You felt Heinz was a little bit more fragile, perhaps, even though he was a brilliant talent. So he didn't get along with Patrick Head. We know the story. I mean, Damon could handle Patrick Head relatively. So, anyways, it supports your point, Peter. I think it's a
a modern analogy would be like booting not Verstappen, but like I don't know, Leclerc for Hülkenberg, for example, something like that. It's like just why?
Or after 2016, then obviously Rosberg retired. If it had booted Rosberg for Bottas.
Oh yeah, something like that. Yeah, but so yeah, he gets booted, goes to Arrows. I mean, okay, he actually chose them because the other teams didn't want to pay him enough or something. And then Jordan, and then the team utterly transforms in the mid '98, and then he gets shat on by Frentzen in '99 and just gives up. And it's a very very bizarre career because actually because of his age, he probably didn't have much left in him anyway because he would have been 39 when he 38, 39 when he retired. So he maybe could have carried on for 2 more years at the most.
But he didn't care enough.
In that Jordan, which was useless as well. So it wouldn't have been fruitful to do so. He really should have started racing like 83, 84. Not,
I mean, that was
92.
he only started car racing in about 1984. He started off motorbike racing and then moved to car racing in about 1983, 1984, and that's when because his dad didn't actually leave any of his fortune because Graham, his plane crash happened and he was flying illegally and all of the money went to all the insurance guys. Essentially, his family grew up broke.
Well, I think didn't his mum try and also discourage him from racing?
It was dangerous, and so decides to go to car racing, which is so much more safe.
I didn't know that. That's actually incredible. It's an inspirational story. I'm going to go out on a limb here because this is a guy who, like you said, had his fortune of his father not really going to him, but he wasn't really like a rich kid. But he had this like weight on his shoulders to like stack up to his father. And at an age many people might consider like your career has been set, he starts something new and he succeeds at it. So I give Damon credit. I don't dislike Damon Hill. I think he has a very interesting career. It's inspirational. To start something at 32 and then become the best at it or win the title. You could argue whether he was the best at it. I mean, he was one of the better drivers, certainly. I like that. I actually don't like that we have 15-year-old prospects right now. Like, go out and play in the park. Like, stop. Like, have your childhood. Like it doesn't mean that just because you're younger that you're better. And Damon actually proved that someone can come in at 32 and learn something like an 18-year-old would and be quite good at it. So I admire Damon Hill. Overall, I just think that, probably as a driver, he doesn't stack up to Michael, but who did?
In terms of a story, in terms of making what he did from his situation, he was very good at that. It's just that I made a video on him and I was sick and tired after making that video and posting it that there were people there were obviously Hill fans from the 1990s saying that, well, Hill got 22 wins between 1993 and 1996, and Schumacher had 21. Therefore, Hill was just as good as Schumacher. And it's like, no.
That's absurd. That's absurd.
Oh, look at the cars Michael was driving.
Damon had a much better car, period. I mean, to be honest, Damon should have won the title.
In all 4 of those years, if he was a really good driver.
In all 4 of those years, yeah. Exactly.
If Senna had lived or if Prost had stayed on, they could have got probably more than 40 wins across those seasons. With those
to be fair, Prost maybe not, because Prost was 40? He was 40 when he retired.
Prost's 93 was actually deceptively inconsistent for his standards. He did not have his best season. There were some races Damon was just clearly better than him.
He didn't like the car. He didn't like active suspension or anything like that.
Exactly.
And he didn't. So he didn't really work.
But I would argue that 93 car is every bit as impressive as an engineering feat as any car ever. That thing was a total piece of car.
Well, it was a more refined version of the FW14. Basically, it's just that the FW14 suited Mansell perfectly.
This is one of my left field opinions. I think that obviously we had Mansell come in for some races in 1994 after Senna died. I think that after Senna died, if they'd have put in Mansell, obviously give them the one race for Monaco because that's what they did back in the day. They gave one race for respect. If for the race after Monaco, which I think was Spain, if they'd have put Mansell in from Spain onwards, I think he'd have won the title. Ooh, I think if he'd have ditched his IndyCar commitments, I think he'd have won the title.
You mean instead of Coulthard? You mean?
Yes.
Oh yeah. I mean that would have been everyone would have gone mental for that to see Mansell and Hill together in a Williams.
Yeah.
That would have
That would have brought the
been some
house down.
serious anti-German sentiment going on at that. That would have been one of the most patriotic British lineups ever.
It would have been the McLaren.
Mansell and Hill.
It would have been the McLaren dream team of the early 2010s times a million, basically.
Oh yeah, way more than that. Way
Yeah.
more. I mean, Mansell was like a god among the British public. I don't think we realize because we weren't alive. But you look at the pictures. I've never seen a driver from Britain adored like that by the British public. I mean, I'm talking about just pure adulation, people storming into the middle of a racetrack with the son of Graham Hill next to him. It's an interest. I never thought about that. Would Mansell have won that title?
I believe
in
so.
'94.
Like,
so you think he would have beaten Damon? You think he would have beaten Damon?
The thing that tipped over for me is Adelaide. Damon Hill's going into at that point the most important race in his career. And what happens in qualifying? Mansell beats him by 6 tenths and puts it on pole. And then the only reason why he doesn't win the race, or he wins the race eventually because of a crash between him and Schumacher, but the only reason why he didn't win that race on merit was because he wheel spun at the start and didn't want to stay. He actively said he didn't want to get involved in the fight for the championship. So he just when he got that wheel spin, he just let Schumacher and Hill by, and just sat in third.
I mean, I think he could have won the title actually, because the thing is, he was a very demanding driver. He would have come in saying, "Okay, I need to be paid this much per race. I need to have undisputed."
I think he was being paid like £1 million per race.
He was already being paid more than Hill was. I think Hill was paid like 100 grand for the season, and he was on like $1 million per race. He would have demanded number one status as well. So I think it would have been. I mean, at that point, Damien Hill, again, only his second full season, he probably would have been like, okay, I guess I'm playing the number two because I was doing that already with Senna. On that basis, if you think he's not going to end up taking huge amounts of points off, and if we assume that Schumacher still gets himself, that 2 race ban and 2 disqualifications, then I think Mansell maybe could have done it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thought experiment. I think I agree with you guys.
Yeah,
I think Nigel Mansell could have won it. I'm looking at the qualifying. I didn't realize that's a huge margin in Adelaide in qualifying. That's absurd. And that was Mansell coming back, right? Pretty cold.
Yeah, he only did about 3, I think he only did 5 or 6 races that year. Maybe not even that. Maybe 3 or 4. And he did it because he was doing IndyCar as well. There were breaks between the races. He never did 2 races. He never did 2 races consecutively.
That is actually remarkable. Look at that, David Brabham in 24th. What a shame.
Yeah. And this was all about Brabham. We've now been waffling about Damon Hill and Williams.
Yeah, we've kind of gone off kilter a bit. I mean, we did this a lot in this episode, but well, at this point, Brabham are dead. They've disappeared. Yeah. There was an attempt to bring them back later, actually. 2010. Yeah, 2010, the year when we had 15 applicants and some
everyone was trying to come back. March, Lola, all them.
Basically, everyone we tried to create a sort of 70s revival in Formula One. And we got part of that with Lotus, at least, came back-ish, but definitely not HRT or Virgin. But yeah, it had nothing to do with the Brabham family again, and they actually didn't want this because they were like, well, no, you can't use our name for this because we're not. I mean, Brabham himself, old man Brabham, was in his 80s by this point. He wasn't interested in doing anything like that, and his sons were either in prison or just racing touring cars or whatever. So someone called Franz Hilmer wanted to do it, but they did not get their entry in. That being said, David did actually reform Brabham, or he attempted to again 5 years later for WEC, but this ran out of money to do it. They tried again in 2021. This time they did actually do a few. They actually built a car for the GTE category and did a little bit with that in kind of low-level endurance racing, but it's not the
Absolutely not the same. And I think there was some rumors that somebody wanted to bring back the name, as you say, like later on, 2009, 2010, but the core of the team was no longer there. The spirit of the team was no longer there. The personnel were no longer there. The team is gone. And I don't think it'll ever come back. I think that once you lose your base, your personnel, your spirit, you lose your team, and there's no reason for someone to bring back something that now no longer carries weight in the way that it did. So, all in all, a really sad end to what was an amazing team and one of the most important teams, I think, in F1 history in terms of dictating, in terms of setting a standard, in terms of technical innovation, drivers, personnel. This is a legendary team. Brabham is one of the greatest teams ever. But it's a case study of how not, in many ways, it's a case study in how to run an F1 team in moments and how not to run an F1 team near the end of their stint. And I look at it as a sad story because they're a team that I think have every bit the heritage that a Williams or a McLaren does. They just didn't have the leadership. And if in a perfect world, Brabham would still be a team in Formula One. But of course, that's not the case.
Yeah, the moment has kind of gone to try and bring it back because there would be no connection unless David suddenly decided he was going to try and resurrect it himself, because like we still have Williams in name only, even though the Williams family are no longer involved. But the thing is, Williams didn't disappear and then come back 10 years later, so there's still that element of continuity with it. But with this, it's like it's not, unless someone from the Brabham family wants to run it, it would not be Brabham to just bring that name back. Because again, Jack Brabham himself, he sold the team 55 years ago, and for most of their history, it was not run under his, with any involvement of the Brabham family. And again, he died in 2014. Ron Taranuk, he died in 2020. So the original founders are long gone. Not that they would be in a position to run it these days, even if they wanted to.
To be fair, McLaren, you could argue I mean, obviously, it wasn't that Bruce wanted to not be part of his team, but he died in 1970. Most of their successes come without it, but I suppose they had Teddy Mayer, they had Ron Dennis, they had, I mean, Martin Whitmarsh, not the best of team principals, but by no means as bad as some of the ones Brabham had.
But again, they've always been here. They've always been McLaren. They didn't disappear and come back. I mean, there have been people insisting, "Oh, McLaren is a Kiwi team."
No, it's not.
It's like, no, it's always been a British team, and the base has always been Britain. The same with like Brabham was never an Australian team because it was founded in Britain, even if its founders were Australian, because their original factory was in Chessington, and then when they came back in '89, it moved to Milton Keynes, which does seem. I should have looked into this. I'm thinking when they closed up, I'm wondering if their factory got taken over by any subsequent teams, because that's quite a common thing for obvious reasons, just of practicality.
Is it at least built Technical Center 2.0?
It's potential, because I know there are some where they have done. I mean, Manor's factory has now been used by Haas, I think. Red Bull, but it's because they bought out Jag that they have the same factory. I mean, it does happen just because you've got the infrastructure and everything you need. So maybe it has, but it's probably just disappeared somewhere in a business park and whatnot.
Get on Google Earth.
I'll look into this, see if I could find out if anyone took it over, but probably not. But yeah, so Brabham. Oh, okay. So apparently the Chessington factory was bought by Carlin actually, for GP2, and used until 2010. So that was but then hasn't been used since 2010. So maybe it's got something different with it. But yeah, there is still even if their factory's been abandoned or destroyed or whatever, if nothing else, we still have all their very nice cars get driven for track days all the time. Even the last one, even that pink car that Damon Hill, maybe because Damon Hill drove it, and it's the last Brabham, you still see that one doing track days every once in a while. But yeah, one of the big old school names from the past that have definitely left their mark on Formula One. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.
Goodbye.